It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm going to be here to walk you through our show today. We got a lot of stuff to get into, so I'm just going to get right into it. As you know, we start with a recap, go on and talk a little bit about the weather, the Vegas lines, get into some of the pitchers to use today, and we'll end up with our hitting options and then the cornerstones that we're going to be using to build our rosters around. Before we get into anything like that, though, today we're offering a free roll over on Fantasy Score over at the RotoCurve community. So if you haven't signed up yet, get over to rotocurve.com and sign up for an account. Start earning your curve points. You can trade it in for merchandise. You can trade it in for money on some of the sites. And we also have a 50% sign-up bonus over on Fantasy Score today. And we're running a $250 free roll. So get over there, take a chance at some free money, make a deposit. You'll get your deposit matched 50%, comes automatically. You don't have to play it off like you have to do on some other sites. So get over there, give it a try. It's a really nice product that they have over at Fantasy Score. It kind of takes the best of FanDuel and the best of DraftKings and puts them together. There is late swap. There is 2 starting pitchers. The scoring is the FanDuel scoring that people are so used to. So if you're going to try a new site, it's definitely one that you should be looking at. Over here at RotoCurve, we're actually running a head-to-head bracket challenge over on Fantasy Score this week. And we're down to the semifinals. So it is our own Michael Rathburn of RotoCurve fame going up against Joe Walker. And in the other matchup, we have two of our constant posters and contributors over on the site. Eric and Kenny are going to be going up in the other semifinal. So we're getting down to the end. Remember, the winner of this gets $100 cash, as well as a really nice RotoCurve fleece that I'm going to be jealous because I don't have one yet, and also a RotoCurve t-shirt. So you're getting some good stuff that you're playing for here. So good luck to those who made it to the Final Four, and let's see who we have matched up in our championship game after tonight. Now, the first thing I wanted to get into, we had a pretty hectic morning for those of you who were over in chat. As you know, FanDuel had a little bit of a glitch in the matrix today. So they usually run a 223-person $5 double up that pays out the top 100 spots. But for some reason today, everything was getting doubled over on FanDuel this morning. So they ran a $5 double up, and instead of $5, you're getting paid back $20 for everybody who comes in the top 100. So basically, there's 223 entries at $5, or about $1,100 going into the pot. And the payouts are going to be, the top 100 are going to get $20. So they're paying out $2,000. So you're basically playing for 50% overlay right off the bat. So I sent out a tweet earlier this morning to tell everybody, and we were talking about it in chat. If you haven't gotten into them, they're all done. They're all filled up now. But for those who got into them, I said, we'll talk a little bit about the strategy you should use in order to maximize your return on it. There's basically 2 ways you can go. If you're an all-in kind of person, then you're basically playing a 50-50 today for 4 times your money. So if you're the kind of person who wants to make a big score, if you were able to get into all 8 or 9 of the double ups that they had out there, you got $40 or $45 out on the table. And if you are able to put together a roster that comes in the top 100 out of 223, you're going to wind up making 4 times your money. So you're going to turn that $40 that you invested into 160, basically in a 50-50. If you got into 45, you're going to turn it into 180. So if you're a kind of person who likes to go all in and wants the odds in their favor, this is probably the best odds you're ever going to get on it. So this would be a day to, if you're really confident in the lineup, to let it roll. Now, the other way, though, is if you're somebody who's grinding out a profit and you're trying to make some money, here's another way you can go about it. Let's say you got into 3 of these, or you got into 6 of these, any number that is kind of divisible by 3. What you can do is you can run 3 separate lineups with the hopes that one of those 3 does get into the top 100 and it'll pay you off. Now, if you had 3 lineups, you put $15 out. If any one of those 3 get into the top 100, or basically the top like 45% of that tournament, you're going to wind up getting paid back $20. So you're going to make $5 on your $15 investment. Now, that's at a minimum if you're able to get one of the 3 in. If you sneak a second or a third one in, then you're going to make even more money than that. You're going to make 40 if you can sneak in 2 of them, and you're going to make 60 if you sneak in the 3. $15 investment, that means you're going to have either a $25 profit on a $15 investment, or you're going to have a $45 profit on a $15 investment if you're lucky enough to get all three of them in there. So just think about that when you're doing your lineup construction. If you're somebody who likes to go all in, make the lineup that you would have made for your cash games on FanDuel and put it in here today. Like we said, you're playing a 50-50 for 4 times your money. You know, you're never going to get better odds than that. If you're somebody who's just trying to grind out a little bit of a profit, though, you know, put in 2 or 3 different lineups. This way you're spreading the risk around. If one of your lineups falls flat on your face, if your starting pitcher gets blown up, you know, you still have the other lineup that can get in there. And even if you run 2 lineups, you know, you're basically getting a $20 return on every $10 you invested. So you're getting a 2-to-1 return and you're giving yourself, you know, more options to go. So again, that's the way I'm probably going to do it today, because there is also nothing that says that both of those lineups you make can't make it into the top 100. If you're a player who feels that, you know, you have an advantage over most of the field, well, if you make 2 separate lineups and they both make it into the top 100, you're still going to get the maximum payout you can get anyway. If you go all in and you do actually, you know, pick a pitcher that gets blown up, which, you know, I mean, for everybody who used Felix Hernandez last week, you understand that, you know, stuff like that can happen. If you want to make sure that you kind of spread your risk a little bit to make sure you give yourself the most upside, I'm thinking the way to do it is going to be splitting it up into maybe 2 or 3 cash game rosters today. Normally, that's not something I advocate. I say you put your best team together and you roll with it. But in a situation like this, you know, basically when the odds are in your favor, you can play it a little differently. So as a gambling man, that's the way that it makes the most sense for me to go about it. So from there, we're going to move on. That's just, you know, something I promised you guys I would talk about on the show early today. If you didn't get into it, like I said, the double doubles have already filled up. Everybody heard about it real quick. It was out on Twitter. And, you know, you're not going to be able to do it again. I'm sure FanDuel is fixing the problem right now. But when something like that does come up, you know, you got to take advantage of free money where you can. So going on, let's talk a little bit about last night's slate. Cheap pitchers basically ruled the day last night. R.A. Dickey finished with 27 points. So if you had Dickey, he basically matched what you got out of Greinke last night. Greinke was probably the top guy to pay up for. The 3 guys that were options were Archer, Greinke, and Garrett Cole. Those were the 3 guys that most people were paying up for. There was also a lot of people on Salazar yesterday, too. He was kind of like that mid-tier kind of guy. But Greinke was really the only one who came through for you. He pitched a pretty good game, wound up with 28 points on DraftKings. But like I said, you could have had a cheap guy like Dickey who wound up with 27 and saved you about $3,000 that you could have used on your bats. A guy who we talked about in chat before the game yesterday was Jeremy Guthrie. Guthrie doesn't have a lot of left-handed bats that scared you off in that Milwaukee lineup. So he usually is a guy that struggles with lefties. But if a team doesn't have any lefties, he's been pretty tough on righties over his career. So he was actually a pretty good start yesterday. On DraftKings, he was 4,800, which was where we said he's probably the guy that you would want to use over there. He gave up a couple runs at the end of the 6th inning there. Otherwise, he would have finished over 20. But by picking up the win, he wound up with 17.5 for you at $4,800. And again, part of the reason why we were on him yesterday is the late Vegas line started moving in his favor pretty big. And when you looked at all the underlying stuff, like the fact that Milwaukee has no lefties, and, you know, Guthrie has been solid getting numbers in the teens in his last couple starts. You know, he was a guy that it made sense to put in there as a salary saver. Now, I was trying to explain to somebody yesterday that Greinke cost $9,900 yesterday, whereas you could have had a guy like Guthrie for 48. So basically, Guthrie was half the price that Greinke was. So Guthrie getting 17.5 points is kind of the equivalent of you getting about 35 points out of a guy like Greinke. Now, again, there are some, you know, long equations that you can go through that says, but you gave up points on the spot. You sacrificed points to somebody who would have been a higher pitcher. Yes, that is true. But yesterday, the guy that everybody wanted to fit in their lineup was Giancarlo Stanton. So think about your lineup that you had yesterday. If you weren't able to fit Stanton in, take the guy who was your worst player that was about $2,000 or $3,000. Take him out of your lineup and put in Stanton in your lineup now. Now put Guthrie in there for whoever your other starting pitcher was that got you around 20 points or so. And you still have about $2,000 left that you can go down and upgrade another position to a better bat that you would have wanted if you had cash. So the reason you use a guy like Greinke, a guy like Guthrie, especially in a tournament, is it opens up different avenues for you to fit in more studs that other people aren't going to be able to fit in if they put a pairing of, you know, let's say Greinke and Cole or Greinke and Archer on their rosters yesterday. So that was the reason why we liked Guthrie, and that was the reason why we told you. And a couple people who used them last night were like, hey, you know what? That worked out pretty well for me. So when situations like that come up with cheap pitchers, you know, you always gotta be mindful of it, because value is the name of this game. Value in matchups is what you really got to concentrate on. So going on from there, let's see. We had Garrett Cole pitched okay. He wound up with 20. The two guys who blew up people's rosters as starting pitchers were Archer and Salazar. They both finished with 10 points or less over on DraftKings. And, you really can't do much when you get a guy at that price. If you paid up for those guys, you had to wind up punting a position or two with your bats. And the guys that you punt usually aren't able to make up those, those extra points that you're giving up when one of your studs doesn't perform the way you expected him to. Let's see. As far as bats go, Giancarlo Stanton was an easy pick. He was somebody who I actually told people I'm going to be fading a little bit in tournaments yesterday, which didn't work out all that well for me. But he was so obvious that I figured he was going to be highly owned. And if he had a bad day, you were going to be ahead of the pack if you took a guy who had a better day than him. It actually didn't work out with Bryce Harper getting hurt for me, but I did have enough Stanton and cash games to still make it a pretty profitable night. Basically, he was a right-handed bat going up against CC. CC was struggling with right-handed hitters, giving up a lot of home runs. I mean, you basically take the best right-handed home run hitter against one of the worst guys against right-handed home run hitters this year, and it was a pretty easy play. So Stanton was a guy a lot of people had on their rosters. The top dogs, though, on all the big contests had stacks of Yankees yesterday. You had guys like Beltran and Gardner who went yard. A-Rod finished with a couple hits. He's one shy of 3,000 at the moment. You had McCann finished with like 17 or 18 points. He didn't hit a home run, but he had a couple hits, a couple RBIs, scored a couple runs. I think he picked up a walk as well. So the Yankee stack was the one that we saw most often. Of the people in the top 5 rosters in the hot corner and on the moonshot, 4 of the top 5 had a stack of at least 5 Yankees over on DraftKings. So if you didn't have any Yankees in your lineup yesterday, there's a good chance you didn't make big money. Let's see, some other guys to mention. I wanted to make sure I mentioned Kyle Schwarber. This is only his second start yesterday. He hit a home run, went 2 for 4. He's now 6 for 9 so far in his career since being called up to the bigs. And he's finally available on all the sites right now. The thing I want you guys to realize is he's cheap everywhere. And depending on what site you're playing on, you might even be able to get him as a catcher. On DraftKings, DraftKings and FanDuel, I think he's listed as an outfielder. But if I'm not mistaken, he's like 2,800 on DraftKings, or he was yesterday, and 2,200 or 2,400 over on FanDuel. The other 2 sites that we've been dealing with that you can play him on are Fantasy Aces and Fantasy Score. And on both of those sites, he's listed as a catcher. If you're playing over on Fantasy Aces tonight, he is $42.50 is his price tag over on Aces tonight. We'll talk about him when we get into the catcher spot. But if you're looking to get a cheap guy so you can fit in a guy like Chris Sale as your pitcher, Schwarber's an easy option at a tough-to-fill position for me. And the way he's been hitting, the upside this guy's been showing, you're not going to find another catcher below maybe 47 or 4,800 over on Aces that can give you what this guy has given you over the last 2 days. The other guy I wanted to make sure I mentioned, because it's another tough-to-fill position, is Alcides Escobar. He had a good game yesterday, finished with 20 DraftKings points. If you didn't play the early slate yesterday, the other guy who we're going to talk about later at shortstop is Carlos Correa. And I'm going to be honest, this guy's going to be in a lot of my rosters for a lot of days going forward. The shortstop's been a tough position to get points out of, and this guy's an absolute stud. From what he's shown so far, you really can't go wrong using a guy like Correa in your rosters. So that basically brings us to the end of the recap for yesterday. There's not a lot of weather to talk about today. There's no games that are really popping up as, high risk of not being played that I want to talk about now. But as always, we will have our in-house meteorologist, Danielle Kozlowski. She'll be on between 5 and 5:30, posting a video over at the RotoCurve site. You can follow her over at WeatherDFS on Twitter. She loves it when you tweet to her during the day and ask her, what do you think about this game tonight or that game tonight? Whenever she has free time in her day, she's always on Twitter and she's always available to answer questions. She's been great with that stuff. So, make sure you follow her and don't feel bashful. If you have a question, if you're making a lineup and you're wondering how a game looks, feel free to send her a post. She usually answers pretty quick. So let's move on and talk about the Vegas lines now. A couple things popped out at me. I'm just going to kind of list them in the order that I wrote them down while I was looking at the lines. Tyler Lyons of St. Louis is a minus 165 favorite against the Phillies today. Now, I know the Phillies haven't been hitting the ball real well, but the Phillies do better against left-handed pitching against left-handed pitching than they have been against right-handed pitching. They have a much lower strikeout rate. They have a much higher batting average. So I was taken back a little bit by the 165 on Tyler Lyons. Obviously the Phillies pitching has been horrendous. Minus Jeff Francoeur the other night, basically. He's been the best pitcher they've thrown on the mound lately. But Cole Hamels is injured. He went down. He's going to be out today. So they called up a kid, I think, from AAA who's going to be starting for them tonight. So maybe that's the reason for the minus 165 line. But like I said, this isn't a game where I would look at that line and be like, ooh, Tyler Lyons is a guy we have to roll out there. The Phillies don't strike out a ton against left-handed pitching. They're playing in a good hitter's ballpark, even though they've been playing there all year. But it's definitely a tick down for Tyler Lyons, the park switch. I don't think Lyons is somebody who's in play. So don't look at the line movements like we have been over the last couple games and automatically assume it's another situation like the Guthrie situation yesterday. Despite the big favorite here, I don't really think Lyons is somebody who's going to be in play. There's a game in Coors tonight, which, you know, as some of you guys know in chat, I talk about all the time. I hate when there's a game in Coors because you have to have some exposure to it. It's a 10.5 run spread on this one, so they're expecting some runs to be scored. I think the sneaky way to play it, though, and I don't even think it's all that sneaky, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of the Milwaukee Brewers, and I'm really not a big fan of the Brewers. They've been owned by some left-handed pitching. Jose Quintana had like one of his best starts all season earlier in the year against this team. So I definitely think that Milwaukee is a team that might not be as good a play today as people think it is, especially going up against De La Rosa. Now, De La Rosa has been a gas can in his career, but he's been pretty good this year. He hasn't been horrible. You know, I just don't think that Milwaukee's going to be the team that puts up a lot of runs. Colorado's favored in this one, so I think you have to kind of look a little bit at Colorado. They draw the rookie Jungman, I think is his name, or Youngman is how they say it. Vegas is expecting at least 6 runs out of the Rockies today, so you know, when in doubt, you got to make sure you have a couple Rockies in your roster. Look in your cash games. If there's a cheap guy in the lineup you can throw in, you know, throw him in there. There's a good chance he's going to produce. You're going to get a lot of runs out of that game from, you know, what Vegas is expecting. The other game that I think you're going to get a lot of runs out of is going to be Baltimore and Toronto. Now, Vegas only has the line at 9 on this game, and they have Toronto as a minus 140 favorite. I know Estrada's been pretty good lately, but he's been pitching well above his career numbers. This is a guy who usually gives up a home run about every 5 innings, and right now he's given up one about every 8 innings. Now, maybe you buy into it. I really don't. The Rogers Center is a home run hitting ballpark. It sounded like I was from Boston there. It's a home run hitting ballpark, and this is a guy who gives up a lot of home runs as well. So you have a home run pitcher and a home run ballpark. I definitely think you're going to have some of those Baltimore bats that are going to be in play today. Wright, who's going up, Mike Wright is the pitcher going up for Baltimore. He's a guy who's been giving it up to left-handed batters. So I know Toronto's a team that scores a lot, but there's nobody that really profiles to be the perfect guy to hit off of Mike Wright. But I still think Wright's going to give up some runs. So I'm expecting this game to be over. If I was in Vegas, I would put a bet in on the over here because I'm expecting both of these pitchers to get lit up a little bit. Talking about some of the big pitching favorites, there's 3 guys I wanted to mention, and they're all 3 guys that'll tie into the starting pitchers when we start talking about them. The first one is Carlos Carrasco. He's a minus 160 favorite today against Tampa Bay. Like I said, we'll talk about him when we get to pitching, but I do like the fact that the Vegas line on him is pretty high and has been moving in his favor. The biggest favorite on the day is Chris Sale. Chris Sale is minus 180 against Texas. And I mean, this guy's been on fire lately. He's been unbelievable. Double-digit strikeouts, going 7-8 innings every start. So he's definitely somebody who's in play. We'll talk about him in a minute. The guy who surprised me a little bit, although he probably shouldn't have, is Sonny Gray. Sonny Gray is a minus 165 favorite, so he's actually the second biggest favorite today, going up against an Angels team that, you know, basically has been up and down, but they haven't been hitting the ball all that well. And I'm not a big BVP guy, to be honest, but I look at it and I do pay attention when there's stuff that pops out. Pujols and Trout have horrible numbers lifetime against Sonny Gray. So I definitely think that this is a good spot for Gray, because if you're scared of anybody in that Angels lineup, it's the middle of that order there. You know, the guys like, basically like Trout and Pujols. I don't even know if there's anybody above or below it that scares me all that much. But if those 2 guys are struggling against Gray, there's a good chance that Gray could have a good start today too. So let's talk about the starting pitchers and see what the numbers say. Chris Sale is the number 1 option for me on the board today. I don't mind even paying up for him on most sites because lately he's just been that dominant. He's averaged 16.5 fantasy points over on Fantasy Aces today, where he's only $8,000. I think he's almost a must play over there. So if he's not 50 or 60% owned, well, actually he might be a little bit less because there'll be people being contrarian, but if he's not over 40 or 50% owned in the qualifier for the live final over on Aces today, I'm going to be shocked because he's basically been producing numbers around like 22 fantasy points a game. And if he can get a 22 fantasy point score at $8,000, he's getting you more than 2.5 points per $1,000 of cost for him. And if you can put that into your lineup, there's going to be scores tonight over on Aces to win the qualifier that I think are going to reach into the triple digits, because I definitely can see quite a few guys who I think are going to be high scoring at prices where you can fit them into your rosters. But basically, he goes up against a Texas team that is 11th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching, and they have the 9th lowest batting average at 245 against left-handers. So basically, he's in a good spot. If you think about the bats you're afraid of in that order, without Beltre in there, it's pretty much all left-handed. So you're going to have Sale, who is basically dominant against left-handed batters, going up against guys like Joey Gallo, guys like Mitch Moreland. Let's see, who else? Fielder. Fielder will be back in the lineup today. I don't think he was hurt. I think they were just giving him a day off, playing in the National League Park yesterday. So you're going to have the 3 guys who you're really afraid of, the meat of that order, and it's 3 left-handed bats. And we all know that Sale's dominant against lefties. So this is a really good matchup here for him today. The Vegas line is only 7.5, and I definitely think he's somebody who's going to be in play. He's my number 1 guy I'm going to be using in cash games and putting him in tournaments. He's the rare guy who has the safety to be a cash game play even at a high price, and also has the upside where you can use him in a tournament even at a high price, especially if he's going to go 8 innings and get, 8 to 12 Ks like he has been doing pretty much every time he's rolled out there lately. The second best pitcher on the board, I think, is going to be Sonny Gray. I think he's going to be a guy who's a little bit more under the radar. Minus 165 favorite, 7.5 run line. As we said, he has great numbers against the 2 biggest bats on the Angels, Pujols and Trout. I think there's something like, I forget the exact number, but I think it was like 5 or 6 for 30 lifetime against them. So, if you have a guy that can neutralize the best bats on the other team, it's probably going to be a good outing for him. The Angels are mid-pack. It's not the greatest matchup. They have the 15th highest strikeout percentage. They do have a low batting average against right-handed pitching. They're in 20th right now. Gray has good numbers lifetime against them, like we said. So that's something else that puts him in play if you're somebody who believes a little stronger than I do in BVP. And for those who don't know, Gray has been pretty much Cy Young kind of good this year. He's got a 1.60 ERA, a whip of 0.93, and 88 strikeouts in 95 innings. I mean, you can't really ask for much more out of this guy. He does pitch in a quality park, so that's another bump up for him. And his price today is starting to creep up there, but it's obviously a big discount to Sale. If you needed to come down from Sale to Gray, I'm not going to be incredibly happy about it, but I'm also not going to argue with anybody who decides to go with Gray, hoping that Sale gets blown up today, because I think Sale will be overowned, and I think Gray will be very underowned. The other guy who is going to be one of the top-end options that people are going to use a lot today is going to be Carlos Carrasco. Carrasco, to me, is a tick below the other 2, but still pretty much above everybody else. He's a high strikeout guy. He doesn't go incredibly deep into the games, but he has a strikeout rate right now of 27.4%, and he's taking on a Rays team who has the 7th highest K percentage at 21.1 and is 23rd in the league in batting average at 241. So you basically are getting a guy going up against a team that struggles against right-handed pitching and strikes out a lot. And if you look at the charts that Josh posts every day in the tools section, you'll notice that Carrasco has one of the highest strikeout rates of any pitcher in the major league. He's one of the guys in the darkest green section. I think he's probably somewhere around like 10th to 15th on the list for highest strikeout percentage. So he's definitely a guy that has the upside you want in the tournament. He gives up a few more runs and hits and walks than the other guys that we mentioned, but he's also a little bit cheaper. So depending on the site you're on, I think on Aces, relative to a guy like Sale, it makes no sense to go down to Carrasco. Over on a DraftKings, if you're playing in a tournament and you want to, do something that's not the route that Sale is, I think Carrasco is a guy who has that kind of upside that can, win you a tournament or push you up in the standings in a tournament tonight. That brings us to the last guy I want to mention. The value play of the day, I guess would say, is Lance McCullers. I was looking at his price, and it's astounding to me. On Aces, he's $5,250. On FanDuel, he's $6,700. On DraftKings, he's up to $8,000. So I don't think that's too expensive for him, but I think that's about where he should be priced. But on FanDuel and Aces, this guy is just way too cheap. He's taken on the Mariners. The Mariners have the 3rd highest strikeout percentage in the league against right-handed batters. McCullers is a high strikeout guy anyway, so this is a game where he's probably going to get you a floor of a strikeout per inning. The other thing about the Mariners is, if you remember, last night there were 2 late scratches. It was Robinson Cano because of back spasms, and Kyle Seager, who I think had food poisoning, if I'm not mistaken. So he's day to day, but Cano is somebody who's been, been hurt, and that's what everybody said has been the problem why he hasn't been hitting. But those two guys are two of the big. They are the two biggest left-handed bats that they have in that Seattle order. So if you're going to attack McCullers, you want to attack them with left-handed bats. If you're going to take the two biggest left-handed bats in that order out of the equation on a team that already struggles with the worst batting average against right-handed pitching and the third highest strikeout rate, I'm sure that the guys you're putting in for Cano and Seager, I mean, you're talking about maybe a Willie Bloomquist getting in there or a Nick Franklin. Those are not guys that are going to scare you. Obviously, that's going to be a weaker lineup, and it's already a lineup that would have been a good matchup at full strength for McCullers. So if you can get him, if you're playing over on Aces, 52.50 on him is an absolute steal. He might even be higher owned than Sale in the qualifier tonight because that price is just ridiculous. If you're playing on FanDuel, 6,700, you can get a lot of big bats in your lineup if you use him. He's about 60% the price of Sale. And if you think about it and you look at his numbers, Sale's probably likely to get somewhere between 18 and 25 tonight. You're going to probably get somewhere between 12 and 15 or 16 out of McCullers. So you're getting 60% of the value that you would be getting if you're using Sale. So value-wise, they're going to give you about the same amount of points per $1,000 of cost based on their projections. But by using McCullers, you're going to be able to use big bats that you want in your lineup that have much higher upside than some of the cheap guys you would have to be stuck with if you're trying to make a lineup and fit in Sale. So McCullers is definitely somebody who's in play on FanDuel and Aces for me. Even on DraftKings at 8K, I think you can use him. I don't love him as much over there, but like I said, that's about where he should be priced. That's a solid price for him on DraftKings, and I still think he's a guy that I'm going to have in some of my tournaments and maybe even in some of my cash rosters over on DraftKings today. So that kind of wraps up some of the pitching stuff. If you guys have any other questions about pitching, feel free to throw them up in chat. Josh is our resident pitching guru, and he runs the chat. So if you have any questions, make sure to ask him. I pick his brain all the time about certain things, and he's helped me get onto a lot of the right pitchers and talked me off of some of the guys who I probably shouldn't have been on. So if you have any questions, make sure you ask him. He'll be able to give you some more in-depth stats and knowledge because he does all our pitching projections and stuff over here. So let's move on and talk about some hitters. Now, you're going to see that there's a couple guys that I mentioned in here, but I'm not going to mention a lot of the Rockies. I'm not going to mention any of the Milwaukee bats, and we'll get into that when I start talking about our cornerstones. And I don't think I have any guys on Toronto here. Obviously, all those guys are in play. They're all in games in a good hitter's park. They're all in games that are going to be high scoring. So let's just get that out of the way right now. Left-handed Rocky bats, guys like Arenado and Tulo, they're all in play. Even though there's no big lefties on Toronto, which is really how you would want to attack right, they still hit right-handed pitching pretty well. Joey Bats, Donaldson, Reyes, basically everybody down that list are guys that you can look into your roster. So all those guys are in play. I'm not going to really mention any of them, but like I said, they're all in play for you. The one guy at catcher who I do think is going to be under the radar that I really like, though, is Matt Wieters. He's basically hitting I think he's almost hitting 400 against right-handed pitching so far. Goes up against Marco Estrada today. Now, I don't believe in Estrada as much as other people do. Yes, he's been very good. I wouldn't even say very good. He's been good this year, much better than he has been in the past. But this is a guy who has a long history of giving up a lot of home runs. Gave up 29 in 150 innings last year. Gave up 19 in about 118 innings the year before. So the fact that he's only given up 6 and 40-something innings so far this year just tells me that, a big home run game where they knock him around for 2 or 3 is going to be upcoming. For a home run fly ball pitcher like himself, he pitches in a really bad park in the Rogers Center, and that's why I really like some of these Oriole bats today. So if you can get Wieters, he didn't play yesterday. Caleb Joseph was in there, so there's a good chance Wieters is going to be in there today in the 5-hole. This is a guy who has some power, has been hitting right-handed pitching well. He's a switch hitter, so he'll be batting from the left side, but I definitely think Wieters is somebody you want to put in there. I think Lucroy is going to be incredibly high owned at 3,200. He is actually the one bat that I do like on that Milwaukee team in the Colorado game. But I think that he's more of a singles hitter at this point in his career. And I don't expect Milwaukee to really go crazy and put up 10 runs on De La Rosa. So I think that he's going to be a guy who will get you a safe return, but not a lot of upside. I think Wieters also has the chance to be safe, but I think he has a better chance for upside, and he's going to be lower owned. So that's why Wieters is the guy who I would recommend using most at catcher today. But again, you're going to see a lot of Lucroy. He's going to be really highly owned. If you're playing in a tournament, I think Waiters is a great swerve. If you're playing in cash and you want the safety that Lucroy can provide, I'm not going to argue with you, but just realize that you're probably not going to get a high upside out of him either. So it's kind of like you're just basically using Lucroy for the block, which, again, there's nothing wrong with if you like guys at other positions where you feel you can outscore your opponents. If you're playing on certain sites, the other catcher who I wanted to make you guys aware of is Kyle Schwarber, who we talked about earlier. This guy's a big hitting prospect from the Cubs. Most likely going to be an outfielder eventually, but he is catcher eligible and was a catcher in the minor leagues. So he's a guy that needs to be on your radar. I think on Aces and Fantasy Score are the only two places where he's listed as a catcher. But if you can put a guy in at catcher that has his kind of upside at a low price, I definitely think you want to do it. I mean, whenever you have a guy like, early in the season, we were all using Stephen Vogt, who's basically a first baseman but has catcher eligibility. The catcher position is one of those positions, which we'll talk about later when we talk about second base too, where, you basically aren't going to get a lot of points from the average player that's in there. So if you do have to take a cheap option, you can get Schwarber for $42.50 over on Aces. He's a cheap option. He saves you salary, and he's a guy who has 8 to 10 point upside as he's done in the last 2 games. So not that he's going to keep hitting like he's hitting. He's 6 or 9 right now, so he's not going to be a 600 lifetime hitter. But even if he goes, 1 for 3 with an RBI double, at his price, that's enough to pay it off for you. If he picks up a couple walks, you never know too. I mean, right now the Cubs are using a guy like Starlin Castro in the 5-hole, with the power that Schwarber has shown in the last 2 games. He's going to be up hitting in that 5-hole pretty soon. Hitting right behind. I mean, they're using Montero at cleanup spot, and they're using Starlin Castro in the 5-hole. If you have a guy who has the power and can hit the way Schwarber has been hitting, he's eventually going to find himself up there right behind Rizzo as the the right-handed bat to balance out that lineup. So let's move on to first base. First base, there's always a lot of options. We always say that. There's 2 guys that are really standing out to me today, though. And the one who I think is probably the guy I'm going to be using most is Anthony Rizzo. He's in my opinion, he's one of the most underrated first basemen in all of baseball. And if you look at his price on DraftKings, yes, Miggy and Goldschmidt, those guys have been smashing it lately. And I'm not going to argue with anybody who wants to use them either, the way they've been hitting. But I think Rizzo has the better matchup. He's got the home run power. He's got a home run matchup today. Let me see. I wanted to look at the numbers here. They're playing Phil Hughes. Phil Hughes is an extreme fly ball pitcher. So it puts Rizzo in a really good spot. Let's see. He is about $1,000 cheaper if I have this correct. Yeah, he's $4,800 over on DraftKings. Over on FanDuel, he's $4,300. You would have to pay up $5,400, I think, to get guys like Goldie and Miguel Cabrera today at your first base spot. So if you can save $1,000 and get a guy like Rizzo who has the same upside, he's going to be the guy who I've been using most in my early rosters. The other guy who I think I'm going to be using as a swerve for tournaments that goes a little under the radar is Mark Teixeira. Teixeira's a switch hitter. He's going to be batting up from the left side against Verlander at Yankee Stadium. Now, I am not a believer in Verlander. I watched his last start. He didn't look all that great. And, I mean, I know this is a guy who has name recognition, but that's actually why I like Tex, because you're going to have people looking and saying, oh, I can't take him against Verlander. But Verlander is basically a guy who throws a lot of fastballs, and he's a right-handed pitcher. Well, the one thing that Tex does very well is hit right-handed fastballs from right-handed pitchers, especially in Yankee Stadium with the short porch batting from the left side. So you have the matchup that you want with a guy like Teixeira. And again, because of the name brand of Verlander and the fact that Tex is not really like a sexy guy at this point in his career, even though he has 18 or 19 home runs already this year, I think he's going to go under the radar, and he could be the guy that could really help you in the tournament with a big home run or two. And I expect the Yankees to really knock Verlander around. So I expect to see a lot of runs coming out of that game. So I think Tex is going to be the guy who can be the swerve that, could push you over the hump in the tournament. Obviously, if you have the money to pay up, a guy like Rizzo's a great play. I'm not going to argue with anybody who goes with Miggy or Goldie. Both of those guys have been, just absolutely on fire lately. Miggy's got a decent matchup. Goldie's matchup's a little bit tougher, but again, the way these two guys have been hitting, you can't argue with either one of them either. Moving on to second base, there's one guy who I think you can pay up for today, but I don't know if I'm going to be doing it in a lot of spots, and that's Jason Kipnis. He has a 10-game hitting streak, goes up against a pretty weak righty in Nate Carnes, so he does have a good matchup. It's going to be on top of that order like he has been lately. Basically, this guy's been doing a little bit of everything. He's got about 6 or 7 runs scored in his last 9 games. He's also been walking a lot. I think he has 6 walks in his last 9 games as well. So besides the fact that he has a 10-game hit streak, he's also been walking. I think he's been on base more than once in 7 of his last 9 games or 7 of his last 10, something along those lines. So he's definitely somebody who is going to be able to rack up points for you. If you're playing on FanDuel and you get a guy who gets on base 2 or 3 times and scores a run or 2, that's going to return the value that you're looking for out of him. Over on DraftKings, I mean, even if he walks and hits a single, that's 5 points. And if he scores a run, he's going to get you to 7 or 8, which is quality cash game value. And again, Carnes is not a great pitcher, so he has the upside of he's got a little bit of power. He can hit some doubles. He can hit some homers. So he's one of those guys that I think you would want in your lineup if you are going to pay up at second base. But like I said, with the high price of pitching today, there's going to be some positions that you need to punt. And there's a lot of guys at second base in that middle tier below Kipnis who really don't do a lot for me. On an average daily basis, second base, shortstop, and catcher are usually the 3 lowest scoring positions. Second base being second in that list, right below. Catcher and shortstop basically alternate back and forth. It depends on who hits home runs and stuff like that. But if you have a second baseman, a shortstop, or a catcher, most of the time, if there's one guy that stands out there, which we'll get into when we talk about shortstop, because there is today, that's the guy that you want to put in your roster. If you have to pay up for him, you pay up for him. Kipnis, I think, is a good option, but he doesn't stand out to me as a guy that I have to have. I think he's somebody who will be solid. I think he's a great cash game play, but I don't think he's in line for, a slam dunk for a 15 to 20-point performance today. Could he hit a home run and give you that on DraftKings? Yes, of course he can. But that's basically what I wanted to get at. Most of the time with most of these second basemen, you're hoping that they do something that they don't do often. You're hoping today's the day they hit a home run. You're hoping they pick up 2 stolen bases. You're hoping they go 4 for 4, because that's the only way to really get a big score out of them on most of these days. So on a day like today, I think it's okay if you go down and you punt with a guy who has either the ability to hit a home run or the ability to steal a couple bases, or is cheap and getting moved up in the lineup where he has the ability to pick up a couple hits and a couple runs and, get you that same solid score that you can get for Kipnis at half the price. And to me, the guy who I've been putting in lineups to save salary earlier today is Derek Dietrich. Now, Dietrich's been pretty good so far. He's been up for about a week or so. He's been playing third base, but he's listed as a second baseman on most sites. He's been playing third because they had to, jostle some people around with the Prado injury. But basically, he's been hitting 308 since they pulled him up. And he has 6 home runs in his last 150 at-bats over the last 2 years against right-handed pitching. So he is a guy that has home run power. He has home run upside. He goes up against Mike Leake today. And Leake has already allowed 10 home runs to left-handed batters this season. So if you have a guy like Dietrich getting a park bump as they switch over to Cincinnati and going up against a pitcher who's a high home run pitcher like Mike Leake is, I think that he's a sneaky guy that you could take for min salary in a tournament and hope that you get that home run or hope that you get a couple hits out of him and wind up getting a big return. Because he's so cheap, you don't need him to do a ton. If he gets like 2 hits for you and scores a run, that's probably enough to give you solid value with a guy like that today. So when I don't like a position, like I don't like second base today, I think looking for a punt play is definitely the way to go. Dietrich's been hitting in the 2-hole lately as well, so he'll get that extra at bat. So he's definitely the guy who's on the top of my list. Obviously, when lineups come out later, if there's some other second basemen that are getting moved up and are in that same type of situation, there might be more people that you can look at. But for now, Dietrich is definitely the guy for me. Third base and shortstop, I really am only looking at one guy at each position today. Manny Machado is the guy I love at third base. Goes up against Estrada. We talked about Estrada already. He's a guy who has a history in his career of giving up a lot of home runs. And he's an equal opportunity home run allower, meaning he'll give up, when he gave up 29 home runs, I think it was 14 to left-handed batters and 12 to right-handed batters. 14 to left-handed batters, 15 to right-handed batters. And then the year before when he gave up 19, it was like 11-8 or 10-9. So it's not like one-handedness of batters hitting home runs off him and the other one isn't. He's basically a guy that gives up home runs to everybody. Machado has 5 home runs in his last 9 games. This guy has been absolutely on fire since they moved him up to the top of the order. He had a 2 home run game a couple days ago where we recommended him and we were on him. He's going to be batting on top of that order. He's a visiting team, so he's going to get 9 full innings of chances to get at bats. I expect him to probably get 5 at-bats today. So on DraftKings, I definitely think he's worth paying up for. On some of the other sites, he's not as pricey, but he's getting up there. On Aces, he's a little bit to the point where I'm uneasy about putting him in there because I think he's a little too expensive. On FanDuel, I think he's 3,800, which I think is a pretty solid price for him. And over on Fantasy Score, I don't think he's overly expensive too. I was able to fit him in over there and not really feel queasy about it. But Machado is definitely the guy who I'm looking at third base. There are a lot of other options. I know Josh Donaldson is a guy who I think is going to be sneaky. People try to only play him against left-handed pitching, but if you look at his numbers this year, he's been hitting right-handers as well. So he's another guy I think is going to be in play up in Toronto in that game where they're expecting a lot of runs and going up against Mike Wright, who's not a very good pitcher. And Wright's probably also not going to last through to the 6th inning, so you're going to get into that Baltimore bullpen. So if Toronto is able to get up early, you're not going to get the good pitchers in that Baltimore bullpen. You're going to get the guys who are their middle and long relievers, and a lot of those guys are going to be easier to hit off of as well. So the way Donaldson's been hitting right-handed batters, if you want to pay up, I think you can do it, but I'd rather pay up for Manny Machado. That's just the way I see it at third base today. Shortstop, there's one guy at shortstop I'm playing. A lot of times prospects come up and they struggle a little bit right out of the gate, but that has not happened with Carlos Correa. If you look at his DraftKings game log, he's got 4 20-point games already. He's got, I think, 5 or 6 of his last 10. He's been at least double-digit points. And even in those other games, he had a walk, he had a stolen base, he had a run scored. I mean, he had 3 stolen bases yesterday, got on base. I think he had 2 or 3 hits. He had a walk, finished with like 26 DraftKings points. And the thing is, this guy's been doing that often. If you have a guy who's done that 3 or 4 times in his last 10 games, that means that he's giving you probably the nuts at shortstop at least once a week at this point. And, for a guy to be up there, shortstop has been a real tough position all year long. Since Tulo has kind of cooling off from his earlier season plays, there's really nobody that's worth paying up for at shortstop. So Correa is getting a little expensive. He's in the top like 5 or 6, I think, on almost every site. Over on Fantasy Aces, I think he's real cheap. He's only like $46.50, which for the talent that this guy has and what he's been able to do, I think that's very underpriced. But on all the other sites, he's one of the top 4 or 5 shortstops in price today. And he's basically been the most elite shortstop over the last 10 days. So if you can get the guy who's, still flying under the radar, because not the casual player doesn't know who he is. Obviously, the people who are here and playing every day and really looking into the numbers, what this guy has done is going to stand out to you. But remember, not everybody is playing every day. Not everybody is watching baseball every day. There's a lot of people out there, probably, I would say maybe even half the people making rosters tonight have no idea who Carlos Correa is. So don't be afraid of rostering this guy thinking that he's going to be too highly owned in your tournaments. I think he's the best tournament play on the day, and I have him in all my cash game rosters right now as well, because at a tough-to-fill position, like I said before, sometimes there's a guy that stands out. At second base, there's nobody who really stands out to me. But at shortstop, Correa definitely stands out to me as one of the top options today. So that's a position where I have no problem paying up. At second base, I like Kipnis, but I don't think he stands out above the crowd. So that's a position where I think you can find some cheaper plays and, get better value from some of the cheap guys there. But Correa, to me, is somebody who you really can't fade today. He's been just too good lately, batting at the top of that order for Houston. Decent matchup today, not the perfect one for him, but again, I think he just has too much upside. So that pretty much sums up the infielders for us. Now, again, I gave you some high-priced pitchers. We gave you a couple guys that are high-priced in the infield. So I've gone a little bit cheaper on some of my outfield options today. Again, if you have the money to spend up on guys, Trout is not somebody who I think is in a good matchup today. Harper got hurt. So, some of the top-end options that are up there are kind of off the board. But 2 guys who I'm looking at a lot are Lorenzo Cain and Christian Yelich. Cain's been putting together a really solid performance lately. He's hit safely in 9 straight games, and he has about a 5.7 fantasy point average over on FanDuel during those games. So you're getting a guy at 2,900 who is basically averaging close to 5 points a game for you over his last 5. He does very well. He hits very well against left-handed pitching. He's got a 347 batting average so far this year in that situation. And when they do play a left-hander, he finds himself hitting usually in the 2 or the 3 hole for the Royals. They jostle that lineup around a little bit. So he's going to be in a good spot. He's going to get that extra at bat, and he's probably going to have some guys in front of him on base because a guy like Escobar, who we mentioned earlier, has been playing really, really well lately. So you can get him as a salary saver on FanDuel at 2,900. I definitely think he's somebody that's going to be in play today. And the thing I love about Kane too is a lot of people don't know about this guy either. Every day he goes low owned, 6-8%. And again, over the last couple of days, 5.5, 6.5, 7.75. I mean, those are numbers that are, you'll take out of anybody on your team, but especially out of an outfielder who you can get for less than $3,000. Like I said, the other guy who I really like is Christian Yelich. He's hit safely in 8 of his last 10 games, and he's basically been slotted right in the middle of that order. He's the new protection for a guy like Giancarlo Stanton. So they've been going with Stanton in the 3-hole, Yelich in the 4 spot, Ozuna in the 5 to go righty, lefty, righty. He also finds himself sometimes hitting in the 2-hole in front of a guy like Stanton. I think he has a good matchup today. Let's see. Yelich has been 10 runs scored, 2 home runs, and 5 RBIs, and more than 1 time on base per game over his last 10. I still think he's a little bit low priced. He's only $3,000, so he's right down there with Kane. And again, if you want to use a guy like Sale today, you're going to need to put some of these cheaper options with good upside in there. And Yelich is a guy who's great for cash. He's averaged 3.5 points per game over his last 10. And he's shown you that upside. He's hit a home run or 2. He's got multiple RBIs. He has 2 or 3 games with multiple hits. So he's someone who I think you can use to save salary and also keep the upside that you want to use. The guy who's probably been the hottest and is the one guy I'm going to be paying up for in spots today is going to be George Springer. Springer was hitting about 210 about 3 weeks ago, and then they moved him into the 1-hole, and he has just been absolutely on fire. I wanted to look at his numbers here because they were absolutely sick when I looked at him, and I had to do a double take. He has hits in 10 straight games. In 5 of his last 8, he's had multiple hits, and he is 18 for his last 35. So he is hitting over 500 during the last basically 10 days. He's hitting over 500 right now. I say that twice because that is a ridiculous number. 18 for 35 is a guy who's hot, and there's really no argument with that. He faces a left-handed pitcher today. So far this season, he's hitting 282 against left-handed pitching with 4 home runs and 78 at-bats. So he's getting his preferred splits matchup as well, and I think it's a pretty good situation for him. Now, again, they're switching that game up to Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. Roenis Elias is not a horrible pitcher, but he's also not somebody who's going to scare me away. Springer being on the road, being on top of that batting order is going to get the extra at-bat. So I definitely think he's a guy who's worth paying up for if you're playing over on DraftKings. On FanDuel at 43, he's kind of in the middle of that spot where I'm not sure if I want to pay up for him. He's basically the last on the list of the expensive options that I want to put in. I'd rather go and get a guy like a Rizzo at first base or pay up for a Sale at pitcher. But if I have money left over and like the way my roster looks, even with a guy like that, I think Springer's somebody that I'm going to put in there. Now, obviously, if you're looking for a cheap option today, it depends on what site you're playing on. But if you're on FanDuel or you're on DraftKings, we already talked about Kyle Schwarber. He's outfield eligible on those 2 sites. He's very cheap on both of those sites, and he's averaging about, I mean, honestly, like I said, the guy's 6 for 9, depending on what site you're playing on. Even on sites like FanDuel and Aces, where the scoring isn't as high as on DraftKings, he's averaging 10 points a game. On DraftKings, I think he's averaging over 20 points a game so far. Granted, it's young in his career. He's not going to hit 600 for the rest of his career, so there is some regression coming. But this is a guy who has a lot of power, is probably going to be getting moved up in the lineup, and is basically minimum price on both of those sites. So if you're looking for a cheap outfielder, which you're probably going to need to fit in a guy like Sale, he's definitely the guy that I think you should be using. So that pretty much sums up our analysis of today. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of some of the cornerstones I'm going to be using to build my rosters. In cash games, I'm going to have a lot of Sale and a lot of McCullers. Over on DraftKings, I might try to squeeze some money out to pay up and get a combination of like a Sale and a Gray, or maybe a Sale and a Carrasco here or there. But most likely, if it's not McCullers and Sale, it's going to be Sale and Sonny Gray. I don't hate Gray and I don't hate Carrasco, so if I had money left over to come down or up from a guy like Sale or McCullers on DraftKings, I would be okay to do it. But if I wind up with Sale and McCullers, I think those are the 2 best options on the day, and we already discussed the reasons why earlier. Now, for a tournament, if you're playing on sites where McCullers is dirt cheap, like FanDuel or Aces, I definitely think he's worth the tournament bullet. You can build a really nice roster around the guy as cheap as McCullers, while everybody else is, reaching for punt plays to fit in a guy like Sale if you're playing on FanDuel. If you're playing over on aces, McCullers at 5,250 is obnoxiously cheap, and there is no reason that I can see not to use him in a matchup as good as this matchup today. Like I said, I expect him to be even higher owned than Sale in the Fantasy Aces qualifier tonight, and I see no reason why you wouldn't want to use, one or both of those guys on a lot of your rosters. Basically, if you're looking for a swerve play, like I said, you can go with guys like Gray and Carrasco. Carrasco has the better upside probably because he can have one of those huge 10 or 12 strikeout games. Not that I don't think Gray can, but Gray's more of like a 7 innings pitched, 8 strikeout guy who limits the other team to, less than a hit per inning and maybe 1 or 2 runs. And there's nothing wrong with that. He's consistently that good. He's a great cash game play if you want to use him on a 2-pitcher site. I don't think he has the same upside as a guy like Sale or Carrasco because he doesn't have the strikeout percentage that those guys have, but he's still very good. I mean, you're not going to get any arguments from me if you decide to use Gray tonight. So as far as pitching goes, those are the 4 guys who I'm going to be using and the spots I think you should use them and move them around in. When it comes to bats, now see, this is where it gets tough because if you're coming to bats, like I said, anybody who's on Toronto, anybody who's on the Rockies, if there's cheap guys batting in good spots up there, that's what you want to look for your punts because there's going to be a lot of runs in that game. And if you can get some of those cheap guys that, are going to be a part of it, you're going to wind up with a good score from most of those guys in most cases. But Correa at shortstop is the guy who's going to be in almost all my lineups so far today. He's far and away the best shortstop for me, and I definitely think he's the best option. Machado and Waiters at catcher and third base are 2 other guys I have in a lot of my rosters so far. I think they're great cash game plays. I think they're definitely guys who, like I said, I'm not a believer in Estrada. I expect that game to be 7-6, 8-5, something like that. So I think there's going to be runs on both sides of it. Even though Baltimore is the underdog, I think that has more to do with the fact that Mike Wright is not a very good pitcher. I think the way to build your rosters today is to take those guys, put the pitching in that you want. I think today's the day you pay up for your pitching and get your pitching right, and then fill out the rest of your roster with stars and scrubs. I think there are a lot of cheap bats that you can put in your roster today. Like I said, a guy like Schwarber, whatever site you're playing on, he's way too cheap. If he's in there for the Cubs, you got to put him in play. You got a guy like Dietrich who's batting in the 2-hole. These guys are not just values, they're extreme values. They're guys that are incredibly, incredibly cheap. And the thing is, they have upside. Like, it's not, I tell people all the time, when you want to punt, you don't want to take a guy just because he's the cheapest guy on the roster. If you're taking a $2,000 punt that's batting 8th going up against Chris Sale in a bad hitter's park, that's not a guy who you want to play. Even at 2,000, that guy's not a good value. Guys like Schwarber, though, guys like Dietrich at 2,000, they have the upside. They have the splits advantage. They're going up against weak pitchers. They're in better hitters' parks than than some of those other guys. Those are you still have all the boxes checked off. They're just cheaper options. So if you are going to punt, that's the kind of punt play that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about just taking a guy for the sake of taking a guy. You still want to take a guy who's a good value and in a good spot and who you can make a case for. If somebody says to you, why did you roster such and such? You need to be able to tell them, I rostered him because X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, if you can't make a case for the guy, you probably shouldn't have him in your lineup because he's probably not in a good spot for upside. So I think you're going to need a lot of those guys today in order to fit in some of the big bats that you want. So I think today is going to be a stars and scrubs day, even on a roster like a cash game roster. We tried to say this before. You don't want all $4,000 guys on your cash game roster because $4,000 guys don't have the upside that some of the big bats do. If you can fit in a guy like a Stanton in a good spot or a guy like a Miggy or a guy like a Trout when they're in good spots, there's a reason you want to fit those guys in and take a guy who's $2,000 or $3,000 in order to do so, because those guys have elite upside that you can't get from a guy at $4,000. You're probably not going to get 2 home runs from, a Brandon Phillips, even though he's got a good BVP matchup today, but you can get 2 home runs from a Stanton. You can get that from a Miguel Cabrera. So you need those big bats in your lineup as well as the mid-range guys and the low guys. Today, I definitely think there's enough of the low guys where you can go high and low, stars and scrubs. And I definitely think that the winning rosters today are going to have a lot of that stars and scrubs look to it. So that pretty much sums up our analysis for today. Like I said, remember to get over to the RotoCurve site, sign up for the free roll that we have on Fantasy Score. There's a lot going on today. For those of you who were lucky enough to get your entries into those double-doubles when we were talking in chat this morning, like I said, think about how you want to play it. You got a good opportunity here with some guaranteed overlay. So make sure you take advantage of it and try to make some profit off it. And as for the rest of you guys, if you didn't sign up for our head-to-head bracket challenge, we're into the semifinals. We'll be in chat tonight with most of the participants discussing their rosters. So if you want to know how to make a better cash game roster, you got guys who are proven winners that are going to be competing for the big prize tonight, who will be in there and be able to give you some advice, on top of the stuff that you can get from guys like Wrath and Josh and myself. So that pretty much sums it up. I thank you all for joining us again for this episode of The Curve. And as always, stay classy, DFS.